to do that. I'm willing to do that.
We'll have a separate meeting on that because, I just don't see him I don't put him on the same level. And the reason is because we have dismantled settlements in the past. The offer that was put down by Olmert called for dismantling settlements that had, 60 to 80,000 settlers in there. We've shown our ability to do it, with or without a peace deal. That's why this idea of settlements as a big obstacle, I think, is such a red herring. It's created a tremendous distortion of this whole picture. And you don't have to be pro-settlement to believe what I'm saying.
And I think that where we got with Olmert and Abbas in the talks that were taking place in late 2008 is, I think, very, very instructive. And I think that the saddest thing about where we are today is that we've not picked up where that process was at. The Palestine papers that were leaked a few months back, it was December, and we've sort of lost track of that because of everything that's happened in the Arab world. But if you think back to December, and we were reading just how far the Palestinians were willing to go in giving up the right of return, in giving up on some of their most important claims around settlements in Jerusalem, we see that it's an equal red herring that there isn't a partner. Because the Palestinian leadership that you have today is probably the most likely to make the concessions and make the deal for peace that we are going to see in our lifetimes. And if we don't take this opportunity, I'd like to know where in your mind, as we go down 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and there's nobody left to talk to, because after 20 years they just give up talking to us because they're not getting anywhere. And the UN does vote to recognize Palestine, and Israel does become more and more isolated, and there is a majority of non-Jews, whether you like the argument or not, living there. So you now have a minority of Jews ruling over a majority of non-Jews in a non-democratic state that is isolated in the international community. Where does that leave us 20 years from now?
I'll answer your point, all right? This is one time I'm going to really criticize Israel. I think Netanyahu's biggest blunder happened in Washington when his great peace partner, who you call a wonderful peace partner, after Netanyahu took the incredibly difficult decision to have a settlement freeze for the first time among any prime minister. It might not have been the perfect freeze, but it was good enough to be called unprecedented by Hillary Clinton. Well, our peace partner decided to wait 9 months before he wanted to show up to peace talks, and then Netanyahu decided to lie. And he told us, this is my peace partner. And everybody knew he was lying. And I would love to see more candor among politicians. Tell us what you really think. And if I was Netanyahu, I would have stood there and said, I started settlement freeze 10 months ago, and my so-called peace partner decided not to come until 9 or 9.5 months later. That is not the behavior of a peace partner. And I will say one thing. So I'm not as sanguine, or I'm not as optimistic as Jeremy is on our current peace partners. And I was ready with one thing tonight, the Palestinian papers. And I'm going to give you all a website, and it's called Fair Witness to the Middle East. And the woman is called Ruth Laut, L-A-U-T-T. That organization has done a comprehensive review of the Palestinian papers. And I mean comprehensive, in a scholarly way. And there is nothing in there that gives us any optimism that the Palestinians were ready to compromise on the right of return. Jeremy is right that they were ready to compromise on Jerusalem. They were ready to compromise on borders. You're right on those too. But on the right of return, you can go and make up your own mind after you see that website, because I spent a couple of hours on it. And unfortunately, I think that's the rub, is the right of return. This is the big one. Because, this is the one that is really a deal killer. Everybody says it's a deal killer. Whether you're far left or far right, it's a deal killer. And it's not one we ought to gloss over. And when you compare that to settlements, there is no comparison in terms of obstacles to peace. In fact, I think one of the reasons we see such a reluctance from Hamas to come to the peace table is because they know they can't sell the deal to their people. Because they would have to say, sorry, we lied to you for 30 years about the right of return. You ain't going back to Haifa. And I think it's too difficult for them to say it. And that's why they're doing an end run around Israel right now and planning this sort of horrible thing that Jeremy and I completely agree on is a very negative thing for Israel.
Thank you. I would like to, at this time, invite one at a time my rabbinic colleagues. I'm going to begin with Rabbi Ed Feinstein, who's the senior rabbi of...
No, Feinstein. We want Feinstein.
You don't want to start, Eddie? You start, John. No, I've already started. Sharon, do you want to go first? Okay, Ed's going to go first. You know, since I was up here, the room has filled up dramatically. Anyway, Eddie, many of you know who Eddie is. One of our most treasured colleagues in Los Angeles at VBS, involved with Wexner, involved with American Jewish University, and a scholar and a mensch of the first order. Yes.
You both, thank you both for being here, and happy Passover to you and to everyone. You are both fighting against a fantasy, and it's very hard to defeat a fantasy. So Jeremy, you stand against a sort of right-wing fantasy that says that the moment we turn over sovereignty on the West Bank to Palestinians, they will either be infiltrated or overcome by militant Hamas, and the West Bank will become a larger version of Gaza and will become an enemy of Israel. And the deepest element of that fantasy is the suspicion that no matter how they negotiate, the Palestinians simply are not prepared to accept the existence and legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish state, and this is only one step toward its destruction. And David, you stand against a different fantasy, and that fantasy is that the longer that Israel holds on to these territories, the more radicalized they become, and the more dangerous it becomes, and eventually it becomes taken over and infiltrated by Hamas, and becomes a base for even more militant attacks on Israel, and becomes a constant drain against Israel's capacity to defend itself, much less its moral legitimacy. And neither side can make a moral case because each side is fighting this fantasy. And the question is, given the fact that you're up against a fantasy that can't be substantiated in facts, there are enough facts on either side because we're talking about a fantasy of the future, not a situation of the present. The question is, how do you proceed with policy making in a situation when so much fear, so much anxiety, and so much worry attends every conversation?
That's an excellent question. And I think one of the reasons it's an excellent question is that too many times the people on either side of this conversation try to sell certainty. They try to sell the notion that either of those fantasies is for certain going to come true, that we know what the future is, and by definition we don't. Again, I come back to the point I started with, which is that, and something David has written about, that we need to be humble, that we don't know the answers to the questions about what will happen. Those who, like me, argue that Israel can only be secure and safe and have a future that we can hold on to and relate to by making peace cannot guarantee that signing that agreement will lead to peace. We can't guarantee that there won't be future terror. We can't guarantee that there won't be rockets and bombs and suicide attacks. In fact, I would go so far as to say those of us who are arguing for an effort to make a two-state deal need to be honest with everybody up front and say there will be terror and there will be threats and there's going to be a lot more need for security after a deal. And if we're not honest with that, if we promise some sort of a fantasy, if we promise a terror-free world, if we promise absolute peace, if we promise that all our kids are going to go to camp together and love each other, and suddenly it's going to be blissful nirvana, then we're selling you something that isn't the case. I think this is a situation in which we have to judge two not-so-great options against each other. Either we hold fast to the status quo, which seems to be what David is arguing for, and hope for the best, that somehow this present situation can be sustained, that the Palestinians who have 8 or 9% growth on the West Bank can enjoy it and build their city and go about their lives ad infinitum, so that this is sustainable the way it is. Or we have to take the risk of creating a two-state solution and trying to see whether or not it is, in fact, secure and sustainable, which it may not be. Neither one of these is guaranteed. So I think that you're right to point out the notion of this fantasy. It's based in the fact that we cannot predict the future, but we can only weigh the risks of both of these two options. And I hope you'll acknowledge that there's a risk in either one of the paths we're recommending.
Well, you know, I love Ed Feinstein, so anything he's going to say I'm going to agree with. But seriously, and Jeremy puts words in my mouth. I never said I endorse the status quo. I don't endorse the status quo. The status quo includes all the hatred that's being taught and the incitement that happens in Palestinian society. The status quo is a Palestinian peace partner that is staying away from the peace table. And I'm totally against that status quo. I am pushing for the Palestinians to come back to the peace table immediately. So I don't know where he got that as being status quo. I think Ed's point, can I call you Ed? Okay, I know. All right, just call me. You just prioritize Maslow's needs. You know, you just sort of look at which one's more dangerous. On the one hand, I agree with you. They're both like real sort of, whatever you want to call them, fantasies. But there's a risk involved with both. And the question is, you have to try to assess where's the greater risk. That's why, you know, I think there's, you know, we don't live in Israel. And we have to sort of have some kind of recognition that the people there who have a stake in the security know what they're doing. I think there's a difference between criticizing corruption, sexual harassment, pollution, the Haredi monopoly of the chief rabbinate, and ad infinitum. I think there's a difference between making those kind of criticism and making criticism that have to do with the life of my children as they take the bus in Jerusalem. For the second one, I'm a little more careful. I'm a little less cocky about my criticism of Israel when it comes to their security. And I think there's an element of risk assessment there that has to happen.
And I think that's right. I mean, I do think that there is. I would agree with that. But I think that there's more risk that those kids are going to be hurt in the long run if we don't have an agreement. And that's the choice that I think confronts the people of Israel. It is their choice to make. But I believe that there are going to be more children who die and who are hurt if there isn't a two-state deal than if there are.
But Jeremy, what kind of agreement do you think can happen now? I mean, what kind of do you really see? I mean, really, do you see the possibility of an agreement with the horrible state that it's in right now, with one party doesn't even want to come to the peace table? I don't see where you see that this is doable.
I don't understand why it is such a big deal to say to the state of Israel, test the Palestinians. They say they will come to the table if you stop building. So stop building.
They did, and they didn't come for 9 months. And
You're rewriting history. You're rewriting history because the ask that was made of the Palestinian people was to participate in indirect talks. And the Palestinians participated in indirect talks. Now, we may think George Mitchell was wrong to suggest the proximity talks, but we all remember that in April of 2010, the Palestinians came and participated in the proximity talks that the United States asked them to participate in.
If I was the prime minister of that, I would feel insulted.
That was what
I'm not worthy of me being in a meeting with you. That's the problem with Israel. They don't know how to get insulted. They always have that macho Israeli image where they always look stoic and responsible and so forth. They never get offended and they never get insulted. Meanwhile, the other side is always
But just
insulted.
to press the point,
They're always insulted.
you've
So
ducked
my
the
point
question.
is-
You've just ducked the question,
No.
which is, did the Palestinians participate in the talks that they were asked to participate in?
Nothing happened.
No, but did they?
Nothing happened.
You accuse them
There was-
of not participating in the talks. I'm asking you, did they participate in the talks that they were asked to participate in?
You know what? They didn't come to Washington for direct talks for 9.5 months.
But they weren't
That's
asked to.
right.
They were asked
So
to
why
participate.
did they come after 9 months?
Because at that point they were. That was what the Now we can agree the United States may have not handled this well, and you and I might agree. But to say the Palestinians didn't agree to direct talks when they were being asked by George Mitchell, let's start this with indirect talks so we can narrow the gaps before we have direct talks. That was what was asked, and they participated. And to say that they didn't is misinformation and incorrect.
Isn't it suspicious, though, for you? Like, don't you have any suspicion of the Palestinians that all of a sudden they've come up with this great new obstacle to the peace process, which is this settlement freeze, which never happened before? Aren't you suspicious when you see something like that?
Well, I'm equally suspicious that as long as Israel can continue to build, it will. And there won't, I disagree completely with you that the settlement growth that has happened doesn't constitute an obstacle to the creation of a Palestinian state. The notion that Palestinians can have a viable, contiguous state is close to now unreachable because of the extent to which
They can dismantle them. They did.
there are
They did.
roads, there are towns, there are military installations.
Right.
It is, the entirety of the West Bank is being taken over. Look at the maps all across the West Bank. The notion that you can keep on building while you're talking ad infinitum is not a partner who is really committed to the notion of reaching a
But
peace deal.
isn't the building happening right now, Jeremy? Isn't the building happening in the settlement blocks that would stay in Israel? Isn't this where most
Some of the building
construction
is happening, yes. You know, absolutely. But would it hurt Israel for 6 to 9 months to stop? I don't agree. I don't think it would. I don't agree that it would hurt if you can get a peace deal that will secure Israel's future and actually result in a two-state solution that prevents a UN vote in September, that recognizes borders for the state of Israel, that guarantees international recognition of the state of Israel. That sounds like a good deal for stopping a few months of building of a few more settlement units.
But, hold on a second, hold on. I still miss the key point here. What is wrong with sitting down both sides without any preconditions? What's wrong with that?
Because for 18 years, the talks have been going on with no results, and as
You said they came close.
They came very close. It is time now to reach a deal. No more process. It's time for peace. And it is time to stop talking about how to divide up the pizza while the other side is eating it. If you like metaphors, that's the metaphor of what's going on. And there won't be any pizza left.
I'd like to ask Rabbi Zoe Klein of Temple Isaiah to come forward and to address our speakers.
Hello. So, of course, Passover is on the horizon, and we talk about being strangers in a foreign land, and we talk about our exodus towards Sinai and towards the Promised Land, and all of us at our Seders will say the words, every person, every Jew must see himself in every generation as if he has left Egypt. And at the end, we say next year in Jerusalem, Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim. And so I'd like each of you to take all of us to your Seders and to invite us to understand when you next week say next year in Jerusalem, what is it exactly that you will mean when you say that? And what is the role of the stranger and having been a stranger to Jerusalem, to your vision of Jerusalem?
Well, I would start in just a very personal way. Jerusalem is my favorite place on earth. It really is. I lived there for 3 years. My great-grandparents moved there. My entire family, great-grandparents, grandparents, parents, they're all buried on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. There's no place that I feel is more spiritual and more holy than Jerusalem. So to me, when you get to that point in the Seder, it has deep, deep meaning as a place where I find a personal, family, and communal home and bond. I understand, to me, as well, that it's a city that other people and other faiths feel a deep connection to as well. And I understand, because I feel that holiness there, that other people must feel that same deep connection, and that's why it's been the source of conflict and fighting and hatred for century after century after century. And if we don't figure out how to share it so that all peoples can find a home in it, then we're going to condemn our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids to just keep on fighting. And so I don't believe in the notion that all of Jerusalem is ours and only ours. When I think of Jerusalem, I think of it as a shared city that should be there for all faiths and all people, and that we all have a stake in, and that we should find a way, as Olmert and Abbas were doing in their talks, to come up with an international resolution that allows all of us to have a way to have that home. The only other thing I would just add is, to me, the reason why Passover is my favorite holiday, the reason why I value the Seder so deeply, is because of that notion of freedom, and because that commitment as a Jew to recognize oppression in other people is so fundamental to who I am as a person and to how I was raised as a Jew, and it has to apply to the Palestinian people. It has to. That when we treat the Palestinian people the way that we wouldn't want ourselves to have been treated as a minority people in other societies, we are not respecting everything that we have stood for throughout our history, and everything that we say is good and great about the Jewish people. So that value, to me, is something we just have to ponder and think about, and is so meaningful to me and is part of our Seder in my family.
Well, you know, we found something else that Jeremy and I agree on. After Pico Robertson, Jerusalem is my favorite city in the world. I absolutely love Jerusalem. Take my kids there every summer. It does something to me that no other city does. The Shabbat at the Wailing Wall is just one of life's higher moments. So I get that. Walking through the old city is like walking through the Parsha of the week. It's like you get a real sense of timelessness in that city. I spent a lot of time there last summer with Ben-Ami, who opened the first NGO to criticize the Palestinian Authority. He's a Palestinian, and I wrote about it. And, you know, he opened my eyes to a lot of things. You know, he took me to Ramallah. He told me, you know, how many Jews do you think live in East Jerusalem? Somebody take a guess. Not somebody who's very knowledgeable. Some normal person. Tell me, how many Jews live in East Jerusalem?
220,000.
Beautiful. 220,000. Normally, if it's normal people who are not as knowledgeable as you are, you know, they'll tell you 5,000, 10,000. So 220. So we might want to share it, you know, but it's not that easy. When you have 220,000 Jews in East Jerusalem, when you have, according to a lot of polls, the Palestinians, the last thing they would want is to be under Palestinian rule, the ones that live in East Jerusalem, because they get so many benefits now from being part of Israel and so forth. It's not that simple. You know, one of the problems with this conflict, somehow everything gets reduced to these simple ideas. You know, well, we separate the two, you get east, I get west, and then all of a sudden you go and you say, oh my God. And then you get down, you know, God is in the details. He's not just in Jerusalem. So that's the only point I want to make on this one. It's not that easy.
And we agree.
Mashiach is around the corner.
What I appreciate from both of you is not only your obvious love for the people of Israel and the land of Israel, but your warm, open hearts, both of you. And I just want to thank you for that. I'd like to ask Rabbi Shmuley Yanklowitz, who is the founder and president of Uri L'Tzedek, which is an Orthodox social justice organization. He has taught all over the world, has two smichas, one from Rabbi Shlomo Riskin of Efrat, as well as one from Yeshivat Chovevei Torah in New York. He's a Wexner Graduate Fellow as well. It's a pleasure to meet you and to welcome you.
Great
and he lives in Pico Robertson.
So I guess one who interprets charitably my distraction right now might call it an attempted discourse shift. I spend most of my time in sort of two different young activist circles. I spend my time in two different young activist circles. I'm currently a senior Jewish educator at UCLA. In the last 2 years, spoke on 20 to 25 different campuses around the country. And so I speak from a student perspective, and then secondarily within Orthodox and Jewish social justice activist circles. So from the UCLA and campus perspective, I guess the main problem I'm having is that those students simply, for the most part, aren't a part of this conversation. I think most of us are now aware in a post-Beinar era that there's simply a lot of disengagement. I know it's a loaded term. A lot of apathy, disconnection, and beyond something like birthright, how do we begin to construct a spiritual connection to Israel that is not only politicized, where the discourse is not only an intimidated, politicized conversation, but that we build the next generation of Jews who are deeply spiritually connected? For me, it was relatively easy because as an Orthodox Jew, I could go to yeshiva in a small settlement and sit there for a number of years and learn. But for those who don't feel connected in the ways that I do to Torah Yisrael, Am Yisrael, and Eretz Yisrael, how do we construct alternative models of spirituality to even feel connected for the next generation? So that's sort of my first piece. And the second is just for sort of the social justice activist circles, in particular the religious ones that have a certain messianic impulse beyond mere pragmatism. The question becomes, how do we shift this messianic discourse from one of land to one of tzedek, one of justice, and to look even beyond the borders and look more universally once again, and to think, how do we construct sort of the ideal just state, not only with the treatment of neighbors, which is incredibly crucial, but to think more around global causes as well, and Israel in the forefront as ambassadors of tzedek in the world. I think that we saw this with Haiti a little bit, and sadly, many were most impressed because it was good PR for Israel, and I think should be most impressed because Israel should be a state that represents the core Jewish values and how we think of the global poor around the world.
Okay. I'm glad you asked. If there's one thing that makes me saddest of all, when I talk tonight about how this distorted picture has been created, how the obsession with settlements has created a distorted picture, and in the same way that it has covered up real obstacle to peace, in the same way it has covered up the real Israel. And that's probably one of my saddest things, because if you just look at it, just imagine that the 22 countries right now in the Middle East, despite all the imperfections of Israel, despite all the mistakes that it makes, despite all the discrimination and that you can quote forever, wouldn't we all be happy now to have 22 civil societies in the Middle East that approach the civil society of Israel? Wouldn't we be happy? So what I find when Shmuley, when you were speaking about that, I said there is an intersection between the values and politics. And in the same way that for decades now, Israel has been positioned as the curse in the Middle East, the truth is that Israel is really the cure to the Middle East. That Israel ought to be a model. When you see these millions of Arabs who've been oppressed for decades, screaming for their rights, for their freedoms, they're screaming for what the Arabs in Israel have. And like I said, I think it is a miracle that Israel has been able to accomplish what it has in being, despite the fact that it's a country under siege, surrounded by enemies, that it's managed to create this idea, this civil society. Liberals should love Israel. Liberals should support Israel. Liberals should defend Israel. And in fact, and I know you do, and liberals should defend Israel. Maybe the third one I have you on. But the idea, okay, no, so that's good. So let's defend Israel, because Mika Goodman said something great once. He said the mark of a great idea is whether it works in extreme circumstances. And the truth is that democracy in Israel is working under extreme circumstances. So it is a proof that democracy is a good idea. So despite all the imperfections of Israel, I would love to see Israel not just be a light unto the world, but Israel be a light unto the Middle East.
I think that in thinking about how we as a Jewish community handle the Israel conversation and how we expand the tent, the impact on kids is really the most important, because the dynamic that you're pointing to, which we deal with at J Street every day, we have a program called J Street U, which is organizing on college campuses all over the country now, started about a year and a half ago. At our conference this year, we had over 500 kids from 130 different college campuses who came to Washington because they were finally able to find a way to connect to Israel and to the Jewish community through J Street. I find, and I think Peter Beinart in his article, The Failure of the American Jewish Establishment, the point that he was making and that I agree with is we have created a dynamic in which there are two very strong poles in the Israel conversation. There's the pole on the left, which says that Israel is always wrong, and David was talking about it as, the greatest ill, and it's really the source of all problems. And that is the rallying cry for progressive students on campuses. And then the answer from the more established voices sounds a lot like what you just said, which is that we're the light unto the nations, and that we are, everybody should aspire to be as great towards our Arabs as Israel is, and that set of talking points comes at the kids from the other side. And neither of those is very convincing to 80% of the kids on campus. And then those two sides start shouting at each other. Some of you have started shouting at me, some others have shouted at him. And when we start shouting, then 80% of the community just walks away. And they say, what do I need this for? Right? What do this is a land 6,000 miles away. It's got a lot of problems. I don't understand it. I'm just going to worry about homelessness here or women's rights or other issues. And that's what the Jewish kids on campus do. Right? They go and they start marching about Darfur or gay rights or some other social issue, and they disengage from Israel and they disengage from the Jewish community. So our greatest challenge, in my mind, is not necessarily to prove to them how great Israel is, because I don't think that that's going to work. Our greatest challenge, I think, is to provide more of an open space for them to ask questions and to explore and to do what you do when you're in college, which is to investigate these issues from all sides and from a critical perspective. And we have to give more space at our Hillels. We have to provide more of an open approach on our birthright trips. We have to provide more of a space for our kids at our colleges to be able to connect with Israel and do it in a way that may make some of us uncomfortable at times. And that's so important. Can I just...
I'm sorry.
I was just going to answer the second part of your question, which I find to be so important, which is how do you shift this, what you called a messianic discourse, I think, from being so connected to the land to being connected to tzedek and to the values, again, of our people. And that connection is what's going to reconnect young people, right? That's what they want to be engaged in. That's what it is about Judaism that is so strong a pull for them. But how can we say we stand for tzedek if we don't let them talk about the occupation of the Palestinian people? And that is the root problem of why kids just throw up their hands and they say, we can't take you seriously. We can't take this commitment to these values seriously if you say that this is the greatest country in the Middle East and the greatest country on earth, and then we look and we see what's going on the West Bank, or we see some of the other violations that are taking place that don't accord with who we are as a people.
Well, I'll throw a challenge to you, because you said something that I very agree with. You said there are like two extremes. Israel could do no right, Israel can do no wrong. And that's wrong, right? So I'll throw a challenge to you.
Right.
Why don't, at your next convention, why don't you include both of those? Because the implication from what you're saying is that they need to hear sort of both.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it can't just be either all criticism.
Will you come and
or
speak at
either
our
all-
next convention?
I have to ask Michael Oren. No.
No, yes or no? Will you come and speak at our next
I
conference?
will speak. I will come.
Excellent.
I will come.
I appreciate it.
No problem. Be careful what you
Because
ask
you
for.
know why we don't, but you know why we don't have people? They won't engage. We invite people to come, and they won't come from the right of center. the people from the left of center will come, and we don't agree with them all the time, but I think it's a crying shame that people not only from the Israeli government won't attend and tell us why they may think we're wrong, but people from established American Jewish organizations are afraid to come and engage with us directly. And I think it's a terrible mistake. I'm thrilled that you have agreed to come.
Well, you know, this might be one of the most important points of the whole evening for me, is the idea, can you defend Israel and not be accused of somebody who just thinks Israel never does any wrong? Because I'm one of those who likes to defend Israel, but I also criticize Israel. And I think there's got to be a balance here where, you know, it's not either or. And one of the things I find missing that I would like to see more of from J Street is sort of an idea of context. Because there's this idea of context that it's easy to sort of criticize in a bubble. But if J Street becomes just a home for people who want to criticize Israel, that's not good for you either.
Absolutely. No, and J Street's mission is to be a home for people who do love and care about Israel. It's that we love and care about Israel, but we believe it has to have the peace and the security that comes from a two-state solution. So I agree with you 100%. It cannot be about the criticism. It has to be about Israel's future and its security.
Jeremy, your coming to Los Angeles has reaped enormous rewards.
We have a speaker,
David,
our first
we have
speaker at our
we have
next
a
conference.
speaker at the J Street conference next year in Washington. Actually, that's okay. You can oi all you want, but as long as you come. I'd like to ask Rabbi Sharon Brous, who is the rabbi of Congregation Ikar, one of the most creative rabbis in America, recognized by the Jewish Daily Forward as one of the 50 most influential rabbis. She is a graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, and it's always a pleasure to see you and welcome you here.
Thank you. So some of you may have seen Bradley Burson had a very interesting piece in Haaretz a couple of days ago, which was basically an open letter to progressive Jews who he claimed had lost perspective. And he argues that there's a kind of affirmative action that's happening now, which is driven by the one-sidedness and the chauvinism and the exclusionism of the pro-Israel establishment that has led progressive Jews to support and identify with and help Palestinian victims of the violence and to give Israeli victims the cold shoulder, or even worse, he argues. So Jeremy, I know that you know that much of the criticism that has been thrown at J Street is not actually about anything that you espouse or that you believe, but is really about some of the people who've jumped into bed with J Street. And so I wonder if you can tell us what you are doing and what your strategy is to do to help people who really don't have a heart that is open to Israeli suffering, to the suffering of Israeli people, and really don't see the delegitimization of Israel that so many others see. What are you doing to help open their hearts to that? And David, I'm not letting you off the hook. Last year, after the pro-Israel Laker rally on Wilshire, I wrote a piece talking about the narrowing of heart and mind in the Jewish community of Los Angeles in the Jewish Journal. And you told me afterwards that you actually agreed with what I said, but you're a provocateur. So you wrote a response that didn't say that you agreed with what I said, but instead said that you didn't. And so...
It's business is business.
Right, I know, that's right. So what I'd like to do, my challenge to you is to actually ask you to write a piece in which you tell us what you really do believe, which is a piece that responds to the chauvinism, the exclusionism, the one-sidedness of the pro-Israel lobby in the United States, and where you point out, as much as you know it to be true, what a danger that actually is to the future of Zionism and to the future of Israel. Okay.
Thank you, Sharon. You're not invited to speak at the next day. Rabbi Brous, no, she's always invited to speak at the J Street Conference. Bradley Burson wrote a really very important piece, and for those of you who didn't read it, it's on the Haaretz blog. I actually wrote to Bradley after that piece, and I told him that I really felt that the challenge was apt and on point. When there was a forest fire in the north of Israel, J Street ran an emergency campaign to support the reconstruction efforts. When Israel is the victim of terrorist attacks and bombings. It's so important for us to express that we stand with those victims. I think in response to the rocket fire in the South that J Street, which is ongoing, even if there is a ceasefire in the next day or two, it will come back. The suffering that the kids face in the south of Israel from years and years and years, and there are kids 8, 9, 10 years old, they know nothing else than having been living under rocket fire for the entirety of their lives. And it is, the impact of this psychologically and mentally is devastating. And I think J Street needs to do something. I think we need to be helping to fund something like psychological services for the kids. We need to show our deep understanding and compassion for what they're going through. And so I think it is absolutely critical that we do, and those of us on the pro-Israel, pro-peace side of the Zionist movement need to be doing everything we can to show how much we care and that we understand what people are going through. I think in terms of the challenge you're laying down, J Street is in the best position, I think, to be on the front lines for the community of fighting against the BDS movement, of fighting against those who seek to delegitimize the state of Israel, because we can legitimately stand in front of those who hide behind criticism of Israeli politics but really mean harm to the state, and we can call them out on it. And we can say, sure, okay, we don't like the settlements, we don't like the occupation, we disagree with some of the policies, but will you tell me that Israel has a right to exist? Will you tell me that Israel has a right to defend itself against those rockets? Will you tell me that Israel has the right to have a home of its own for the Jewish people, just like all other peoples? And we have the credibility to stand in front of a lot of those groups, call them out, and win over people who have been attracted to those flags. And I think that's why J Street has to be within the communal tent in taking on these fights. And it has to be accepted within the community that when we criticize the policies, don't call us out for delegitimization. We're going to be there to battle with you against those who are trying to undercut the right of the state of Israel to exist, but don't lump us in with those people when we criticize the policies. And I think we will answer that challenge. We will be there with the community to fight that, and we absolutely have to show our love through other means.
Before I answer, Sharon, Jeremy has red lines. I saw something on YouTube where there was a couple of poets or something that just said something that was beyond the pale for you, that was sort of out of line. So he does have red lines in terms of who he will invite to the convention. I just think in light of what you just said, it would be nice to see you use that influence, because a lot of people that come to your convention are pro-BDS. So I'd like to see next year, maybe I'll be in charge. I'd like to see...
Let's not overdo it.
Because what you said sounds wonderful, and I'd love to see it happen. So on Sharon, there's 2 points I want to make. One is on the article, in terms of me agreeing with you, and then I'll get to the second one. The point that Sharon made, which I thought was nice, she said a point that the Jewish community should mutually grieve our losses with the Palestinian people. She believed that a mutual grieving process was something that was called for, that you can't really move forward towards peace until you have some kind of shiva, and then we should hold hands and so forth. I mean, it was really beautifully written. And then the point I made to Sharon was that that's your instrument. It's not mine. Like, I'm not the same person you are. I can't do this sitting Shiva with the Palestinians. I would rather fight the hypocrisy of the United Nations. I would rather defend Israel. I mean, I have a different instrument. We're not the same people. So the article I wrote was, let's respect each other's instruments. I encourage you to use the JCC and do a mutual Shiva sit-in with the Palestinians. Oh, great, I might even write about it. But it's not something necessarily that I would do. And it's not necessary that we should all play the same instruments. And it's not even realistic that we should all play the same instrument when it comes to defending Israel. So that was the point on number one. Number two, what was your point, number two?
The article. Would you write an article criticizing the one-sided?
Oh, yeah, the one-sided. Glad you brought that up, because you don't have to be one-sided to defend Israel. And I think one of the sort of disingenuous critiques of people who defend Israel is, well, they're one-sided. I went to a really nasty school in Montreal. My parents couldn't afford to send me to private school. So I went to this school, Guy Drummond, and it was really a nasty school. And so there was a lot of fights. And I have this image that we'll never forget. There was a, 10-year-old kid on the ground, and he was getting kicked by maybe 8 to 10 guys. And I took so many shots that day to defend them. I'm haunted by that picture. And a lot of times, I feel Israel is that kid. And I feel the whole world is kicking my kid. And sometimes I just got it in me, I got to push back a little bit. I got to push back, I got to defend, I got to inject a little bit of context. That doesn't mean I'm one-sided.
The hour is drawing nigh, and we had promised to take questions from the floor, but my sense is that the hour is past for that. This conversation could go on for weeks and weeks and weeks, and so we'll never finish, even if we would like to. But I want to just say to both of you and to my colleagues, thank you. You have all proven tonight that Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim, this and that are the words of the living God, and we have clearly Avat Yisrael, Avat Medinat Yisrael, Avat Am Yisrael in all of us. And I think the model that we have heard tonight in how to talk about issues, there was a lot of agreement, there was clear disagreement, that this is the model that we in Los Angeles can provide for the rest of the country going forward. Jeremy, thank you. David, thank you. Yasher Koach to all of you, and thank you all for coming.